Thank you very much. We have to figure out how to get the screen up here. There we go. I have to figure out how to use the clicker. Okay, so first let me apologize for the first slide. I'm co-teaching a course this semester with a historian and a political scientist at Harvard called Liberty. It happens to have the number ER34, that stands for Ethical Reasoning number 34, and I gave my standard lecture about drug prohibition to that course yesterday, and so I was preparing the slides for here and the slides for that, and I didn't get the cutting and pasting quite exactly right, so I apologize for that. So, thank Larry for the introduction. I haven't heard many better introductions than that one. I thank all for coming and thank the program and Professor Weiss for having me down and arranging all this. What I'm going to talk about is drug prohibition. Okay? Starting point is just to observe it's a big policy in the United States. Okay? It's not just one of lots of laws that sort of exist on the books and that doesn't have that much enforcement or that much impact. U.S. in total across state, federal, local governments spend something like $40 to $50 billion each year to enforce prohibition. It's a fairly big number, even by D.C. standards. Federal, state, local officials make something like 1.6 million arrests per year on drug charges. That's more than 10% of all arrests in the U.S. Okay? We incarcerate hundreds of thousands, something like 300,000 to 400,000 people in the U.S. on drug charges. Okay, we actually in total incarcerate close to 2 million people. Okay, but even on drug charges, that's more people behind bars in the U.S. than in the top 5 or 6 European countries on all charges put together. So the U.S. is both super pro-incarceration and in particular super pro-incarceration on drug charges. If we were to legalize marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and so on, we could tax them like other goods or like alcohol and tobacco at relatively high rates, probably bring in $40 to $50 billion worth of additional revenue. So if you add that together with the higher number, okay, we're talking about maybe an effect of $100 billion on the overall government budget. That's not just federal, that's federal plus state, but still, it's not entirely sort of chump change. It's something worth noticing. And as we'll discuss, lots of people within U.S. society are affected by drug prohibition in lots of ways. Okay? So we shouldn't just sort of take it as given. We should think about whether this policy makes sense. Now, of course, the advocates of the policy think it has important benefits, and they believe the benefits outweigh the costs. So they would attribute as benefits reduced use and abuse of drugs as a result of outlawing drugs. They would claim that crime is lower as a result of outlawing drugs. They think that the health and productivity of people on the whole is better because we've outlawed drugs. And importantly for many, they would argue that we need to prohibit drugs to make an appropriate moral statement that drugs are bad or that intoxication is bad or something like that. Okay? Now, the opposite side says, sorry, you're confusing cause and effect, or you're confusing what's really generating what. There are serious harms from drug prohibition, not from drugs per se. These harms include the billions of dollars we're spending on enforcement, but much more than that. The harms include increased crime and corruption that's caused by drug prohibition. It includes reduced health and productivity for drug users caused by prohibition. Lots of other side effects that we'll talk about as we go through. So the opponents of current policy say that even from a moral perspective, prohibition is worse. I'll explain that in detail later. So in fact, the treatment is much worse than the disease. Prohibition, the policy toward drugs, is the problem, not necessarily drugs themselves. So I'm going to talk about those opposing viewpoints. As Larry suggested, my view is clear. I'm not at some level claiming to come to this totally objectively. Of course, I'm going to present you with my assessment of the evidence and the arguments and so on. I hope that I came to that view objectively, but of course, we all have our biases, so I won't say that. I told Larry earlier I was excited about giving this talk here because I give this talk all over the place, literally hundreds of times, but usually it's not to economists or people trained in economics. And so I have to kind of soft pedal some of the language. I have to try to say things in a way other than using supply and demand terminology and externalities and things like that. But this is a group where I can just talk about it like economics, and that will make it fun for me and I hope clear. So there are two parts. As with any standard policy analysis, there's the positive analysis, that is, what are the effects of prohibition? Setting aside for the moment whether you think that those effects are good or bad, or how you want to add them all up or balance them. And then we'll talk about the normative analysis. What is a better policy, or what should you take into account in deciding whether you're for or against prohibition? What would you have to believe to think that legalization is better versus prohibition is better? So I want to try to be clear about separating those two things. On the positive analysis, of course, we can in principle bring evidence to bear. The normative analysis will, of course, involve values and judgments that economists have to just take as given. Different people will have different values that they might bring to the table. So what exactly is the positive analysis? We want to compare prohibition to legalization. As you know, if you're going to do any kind of policy analysis as an economist, you have to be comparing something to something else. You can't just say something is good or something is bad. The question is always for economists, compared to what? We're always thinking in terms of opportunity cost or something closely related. So what do I mean by prohibition? I mean that the production, the sale, the distribution, etc., of the standard things that we think of as illegal drugs are criminal offenses, that the violations of those criminal laws come with substantial penalties, not just slap on the wrist kind of penalties. In the U.S., that means jail terms, fines, asset seizures, and so on. I want to include the condition that the enforcement of this policy is substantial. There are lots of laws on the books of all sorts of countries which people have forgotten are even there. It's still apparently illegal in Massachusetts to own a bathtub. Something left over from the Puritan days or something like that. More particularly, there are lots of countries that have laws about drugs that are not so different than the U.S. laws, but that do much, much less to enforce them. And I think that has important implications for interpreting that. So I want to take as given for the moment that we're talking about a regime in which we really try to enforce these laws that keep people from selling, buying, consuming drugs. By legalization, for the moment, I mean we're going to treat drugs like all other goods. Like Ben & Jerry's ice cream, like Starbucks coffee, like toaster ovens, like skateboards, whatever good you want to think of. Of course, there will still be lots of government policies that will apply to legalize drugs under that view. Minimum wage laws, OSHA regulation, child labor laws, environmental policies, etc. But there would be nothing specific to drugs. They would just be treated the same way as standard other goods under standard tax and regulatory policies. Okay? There's lots of things in between. You can imagine all sorts of ways you might treat a given commodity that wasn't full-scale prohibition as we have for current drugs, or full-scale legalization as we have for Starbucks coffee. But I want to leave that aside just for simplicity, just to clarify the discussion for the moment. I'll talk about in-between things in a minute. So the starting point for the positive analysis is simply the observation that prohibition is not going to limit the demand or supply of drugs. Okay? Lots of prohibited goods, and drugs in particular, are obviously continue to be demanded and supplied. The market exists, even under prohibition, even under fairly substantial and strongly enforced prohibitions. That seems obvious, but I think it's important to repeat, to think about, because lots of policies by politicians, lots of statements by politicians, lots of analyses that economists do in their textbooks and their journal articles, analyze the effects of policy under the assumption that people obey the policy. Lots don't. Lots explicitly by economists try to explicitly model how much evasion will occur and what incentives for evasion are created. But there is some tendency to not think about the fact that policies are ignored sometimes. So the first order effect of prohibition seems to be we force the drug market underground. We have a black market instead of a legal market. Prohibition doesn't eliminate the supply or demand. It may affect supply and demand in significant ways. It may be that the black market is very different in some important ways than the above-ground legal market would be, but clearly some market is going to continue to exist. So we want to think about how this different market operates. The standard claim by the prohibitionists is that prohibition reduces the demand, creates penalties for buying drugs, possessing drugs, and it restricts supply by raising costs. We're going to think about both of those in a little bit more detail. So it's certainly right that prohibition might decrease the demand, might shift the demand curve for drugs in. Why might it do that? Well, one possibility is people exhibit respect for the law. They simply don't do things that are outlawed. I guess it's because I'm using this instead of the so, sorry about that. People might just say it's illegal, so I shouldn't do it because my parents told me to obey the law. I was raised in a proper family, blah, blah, blah. I think the evidence is that for very weakly enforced laws, a lot of people tend to violate them a lot of the time. You can think about people speeding on highways as one example. You can think about people who work as waiters and waitresses not reporting all their cash tips fully on their income or tax returns, and so on. You can think of laws that are almost now not even mentioned, sort of anti-sodomy laws that people routinely don't even think about or worry about getting caught for, and so on. Okay, so it seems unlikely that pure respect for the law by itself is going to make a difference to the demand curve for drugs unless there's substantial enforcement of really arresting a lot of people for purchasing drugs. There are penalties, and as we mentioned, there are lots of arrests every year just for drug possession, probably something like 750, 800,000 arrests just for possession of marijuana every year. That might sound like a lot, but if you think about the tens of millions of people who consume marijuana every year, many of them consume it every day, the number of possessions of marijuana and other drugs is huge compared to the number of arrests. Many of those arrests are actually not for possession. They were arrests for drunk driving, shoplifting, robbery, arson, whatever, and the doofus who committed the crime happened to have a joint in his pocket, so he ends up getting charged for the marijuana rather than for the other crime, because the marijuana charge is really easy to prove. You had the marijuana, you're guilty under the way the laws are written. So the probability that you get convicted for marijuana or any other kind of drug possession is quite small. So the penalties are actually pretty mild. Even when you do get caught just for possession, you don't go to jail except in the rarest of cases. So again, it doesn't seem likely that we're shifting the demand curve in very much through prohibition, at least not as it's currently practiced. Maybe if you shot people on sight for possession or you gave them long jail terms for mere possession, you would have a deterrent effect. But under current policy, not much. So what about the supply side? It's certainly likely that suppliers incur costs that don't exist in the legal market. You have to hide your activities. That's more costly than just being able to act in the open. To transport your goods secretly, maybe in less diluted form, so it's more compact. You have to pay bribes to government officials, to police and judges, and so on. You have to compensate your employees for the risk of injury from the violence that occurs in the illegal trade, from the risk of incarceration, the fact that when you're working as on the street corner for an illegal drug trafficker, you're not getting eligibility for Social Security benefits, and so on and so forth. So costs certainly ought to be higher in an underground market than in a legal market, other things equal. But all other things aren't completely equal. One is that black market suppliers, given that they operate in secret, face lower marginal cost of evading all sorts of cost-increasing government policies. Given you're going to hide all your activities from the police, you're probably also not going to pay income tax as a drug trafficker. You're not going to worry about complying with minimum wage laws or child labor laws or OSHA regulation or any of that. So that provides some partial offset to the extra cost caused by prohibition. A different thing to think about is that it seems that traffickers feel a much greater incentive to do a good job than the enforcement, the DEA and the police, feel to do their job. Well, why? Well, if the DEA makes a bunch of big busts and they can show you some dock someplace where they have seized a lot of drugs, they get to be on the evening news and stuff. But if they don't get fired, they don't lose their livelihood, nothing bad happens. When traffickers mess up, they get arrested or they get shot or they don't earn the income they're trying to earn. So they clearly have a huge incentive. There's evidence we'll talk about later that traffickers have systematically learned a lot about evading enforcement over time. I had a former student who had previously been in the Coast Guard doing drug interdiction in the Caribbean, and he said he went into it with the standard sort of prohibitionist attitude, all these guys are bad, we're going to catch them, and what's cool is we have all this great technology. We have certain scanners, we have underwater sort of things that we can use to catch people trying to bring this stuff in. We have fast boats, which good radar detectors and all that. He said, but we realized very quickly the traffickers had faster boats. So we said, okay, well, we've got to get one of those boats. And they'd get the faster boats, and the traffickers would get submarines so that they couldn't be detected at all. So there's lots of other examples of that the private incentives to evade detection seem to be quite strong and avoid some of the increased costs the government tries to impose. Now that's so far just sort of hypothetical, sort of a priori considerations. I'm trying to make it plausible that there wouldn't be a big effect of prohibition in reducing drug use, okay? But we should certainly look at the evidence. Okay? So my characterization is that the evidence supports the view that there are modest effects at most. First, over the past 30 years, drug prices in the U.S. fell dramatically, okay, by like 80%. Okay? Over the same period, the number of arrests, the expenditure on drug prohibition, the number of prisoners, and so on, went up dramatically. Use basically didn't change. Okay? So that's exactly the opposite of what should happen if enforcement is being effective. It should have raised prices and or reduced use, but in fact, prices fell and use did not do much at all. Okay? A different kind of evidence comes from alcohol prohibition in the U.S., existed between 1920 and 33. Okay? You can look at the effect of alcohol prohibition on alcohol consumption with cirrhosis death rates. You don't have good data on actual alcohol consumption during Prohibition because there were no data collected on during that period. And the estimates that I've produced suggest there was a 20% decline in alcohol consumption or a 20% increase once alcohol prohibition was repealed. That's not zero. It's certainly not arguing that prohibition doesn't reduce use, but it's not the case from that experience that repealing prohibition led to a 500% or 5,000% or a nation where everyone was a drunken addict. It led to a noticeable but relatively modest increase in use. If you look across countries that have very different degrees of enforcement of their prohibition laws, and some that are where it's close to being legal, although technically not 100% legal, Netherlands and Portugal are the two best known, okay? You correlate differences in the policy regime toward drugs with the degree of use, there's no correlation. Okay? So there's not much evidence that higher enforcement, okay, does much to reduce drug use. So bottom line, there's almost certainly some effect of drug prohibition in reducing drug use, but neither theory nor evidence suggests that it's a huge effect. Okay? So the critical effect, in my view, is that prohibition generates this black market. Black markets operate differently, okay, even if they're smaller than under legalization, and we want to think about all the ways that black markets are different than legal markets. So first, I think quite importantly, one of the most important things is black markets are likely to be more violent than legal markets. The advocates of prohibiting drugs, of course, tell a very different story. They say it's using drugs, it's consuming drugs that makes you violent. There's something psychopharmacological about certain substances, okay, that causes people to engage in more violent behavior. There's very little direct evidence that supports that view. Okay, there are some studies with animals or some studies with humans in which they consume different drugs and their behavior is observed. It doesn't support the view that the drugs have this violence-inducing effect. Perhaps for a few very specialized drugs, perhaps for alcohol, okay, but for alcohol more so than for the currently illegal drugs. And for sure, there is at least a possibility in the opposite direction, which is that in any market, there are disputes. People disagree with each other about whether debts have been paid, about whether goods that were being transferred from a supplier to a manufacturer were delivered on time, about whether employees showed up for work on time or did their jobs properly. There are all sorts of reasons people disagree in any business, legal or otherwise. In legal businesses, you fire your employees, okay? You sue your competitor. You take out ads in the newspaper that says your competitor's a creep, all those sorts of things. Okay? In illegal markets, it's pretty hard to do that. You can't use the conventional legal adjudication system. You can't go to arbitration. Okay? So you shoot your competitors or you threaten to shoot the kneecaps of your employees who are stealing from you instead. Okay? So again, the effects could go either direction. If you think the psychopharmacological effects were large relative to the violence-inducing effects of prohibition, violence might go up or down. So we should look at the evidence. Okay? And there's lots of evidence that, in fact, prohibitions increase violence on net. Okay? That's true of the history of alcohol and drug prohibition in the U.S. Violence rose dramatically during alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. It fell thereafter. It was relatively low for a number of decades until drug prohibition was escalated in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s and 80s under Reagan. Okay? So that's one sort of fact. Comparisons across countries suggest very clearly that places that are trying hard to enforce drug prohibition have high rates of violence compared to countries which are not. That could get annoying after a while. Oh, come on. If we look at other commodities where people don't think at all that the substance itself is what makes you violent. Nobody thinks that consuming a plastic poker chip at a gambling casino makes you violent. Okay? You still see that when those activities are prohibited, they're violent, and when they're legal, they're not violent. Think about gambling. Okay? The history of gambling early in U.S., the 20th century, Las Vegas and Bugsy Malone and all that, was tons of violence. All these stories about people being shot over gambling territory. Okay? Now gambling is available from the state lottery in almost every state. There are casinos in a large number of states. There are racetracks and so on and so forth. Nobody thinks of gambling as being violent anymore. Why? Because it's not prohibited, so the disputes are not resolved with violence. More detailed evidence that looks case by case at individual homicides, and that are associated with drugs, finds that the vast majority of those cases, there was a dispute over a drug trade, dispute over drug turf, and so on. That's what led to the violence, not consumption of the drugs per se. A different kind of effect is that prohibition might increase income-generating crime. I mean things like prostitution, theft, robbery, and so on. Why? Because prohibition raises drug prices, and that implies more of these crimes for people who consume drugs and get their income from those activities. A related thing is that if the police are enforcing prohibition, holding the police budget constant, they're not spending their time going after non-drug crimes, so there's more likely to be some of that other kind of crime because the police are not focused as much on deterring the other kind of crime. And there's various pieces of evidence consistent with that. Prohibition generates a redistribution to criminals. In a legal market, some of the income generated accrues to the government as taxes. That doesn't happen in a black market. There are no taxes. There actually are a few exceptions throughout history of governments that have tried to tax prohibited activities. And oddly, a few people pay the taxes, even on those prohibited activities. Indeed, in the U.S., in recent years, the government collects a small amount of revenue, like a few $100,000, from people who buy marijuana stamps from the government, because under the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, it didn't technically outlaw marijuana. It said you had to have that stamp in order to be able to sell marijuana, and some people still buy the stamps from the U.S. Treasury. You sort of want to find those people and try to sell them something, because it doesn't make sense that anybody still does it. The point, though, is if there are no taxes, that income that was otherwise being collected by the government is going to accrue to the suppliers as profits. Again, thinking about the positive analysis, this effect of prohibition generating this transfer from the general taxpayer to the traffickers is not a cost per se, it's a redistribution. It's obviously a kind of redistribution that most people would oppose if they understood it that way. Prohibition is likely to reduce quality in the black market. In a regular market, when you get a poor quality product, you can sue the manufacturer, you can try to generate bad publicity for the manufacturer, you can complain to government agencies and so on. But it's very hard to do that in a black market. You don't want to walk down the street to the police station and say, hey, that guy around that street corner sold me some bad crack, because then you're admitting that you just purchased crack. So the standard mechanisms for maintaining quality control are going to be much less effective. One way that quality control happens in legal markets is manufacturers advertise, and manufacturers with a high quality product try to tell you that. Think about a Lexus ad, and therefore you're willing to provide repeat business, you're willing to pay a high price, but that's obviously very difficult for a drug manufacturer who is trying to have a good quality product that's not adulterated, that is what it says it is, and so on. Manufacturers in a black market like the pure forms of the drug, because those are easier to hide from the police. that means when they sell them, the consumers have to re-dilute them to consume them in forms that don't kill you. Okay? But consumers are sometimes going to mess that up. Okay? Imagine that the alcohol manufacturer always gave you just pure alcohol, okay, and you had to mix your own drink. There'd be a few more mistakes made about exactly how potent the drinks were. Okay? So all that means quality control is likely to be less. Okay? So you're going to get more overdoses, more accidental poisonings per use of drugs, okay, in a black market compared to a legal market. We're likely to see more corruption. Why? Because in a legal market, you argue with the government, you argue with legislatures through standard things like campaign finance contributions, through lobbying, etc. You can't do that in an underground market. Okay, so we're going to get bribes and coercion to a much greater degree. Okay, there's substantial evidence of that as well in the U.S. and especially abroad, where the corruption of the police, say in Mexico, is extreme, okay, especially coming from the traffickers. There's a bunch of other effects. Okay? Trying to enforce a victimless crime means that police are going to be much more tempted and judges are much more likely to sort of allow all sorts of invasions of civil liberties, aggressive searches and seizures, because otherwise you can't catch people very easily. If everybody participating in the activity is voluntarily participating in the activity and no one's going to police to complain about it. When someone robs your TV, you go tell the police. When someone sells you drugs, you don't go to the police. So you have to use things like knocking down doors in the middle of the night, okay, unannounced without a warrant, to have a better chance of catching people who actually have the drugs on hand and haven't yet thrown them out the window or flushed them down the toilet. Okay? Racial profiling is a much bigger risk. It's something much more likely to occur, okay, when you're enforcing a victimless crime. Okay? For a regular crime, of course the police could be racist, could be biased. They could say, we think the perpetrator of this crime was African American, even if they didn't have evidence. But ultimately, they have to have a perpetrator. They have to have corroborating things to show that that person indeed was, okay, likely, okay, someone who committed a crime. With drug possession, police can just say, oh, we know that African Americans who who wear blue jeans and their caps backwards and baggy pants are much more likely to be using drugs, and use it as an excuse to hassle people, to hassle motorists disproportionately of one race or another. Okay, and there's clearly good documentation of that from various social scientists. The spread of HIV, okay, is likely to be much higher under Prohibition. Okay, why? Prohibition raises prices. Okay, for some drugs, in order to get a good bang for the buck, you're much better off injecting it than consuming it in other ways, even though there are lots of other ways to consume things like heroin that wouldn't involve injection. So if people are going to be injecting, and if in addition the government is prohibiting the sale of clean needles without a prescription, which many states do in the U.S., then people are going to be sharing needles, and that leads to the spread of HIV. In the U.S., not in all parts of the world, but certainly the U.S. and parts of Europe, much of the recent spread of HIV has come from that rather than from sexual contact. Prohibition tends to foster limits on medicinal uses of drugs because the prohibitionists are concerned about letting anybody have access to the drugs or appearing to legitimize the drugs in any way, shape, or form. Foreign trade, immigration, national security are all more complicated because we're worried about keeping the drugs out instead of just being able to think about whether we want the goods to come in or the immigrants to come in, and so on. Okay, so my summary of the positive analysis says that prohibition probably reduces consumption of drugs, but theory doesn't dictate a large effect, and the empirical evidence doesn't suggest a large effect. Plausibly, a lot of the effects on casual consumers. People don't really care that much about whether they consume currently illegal drugs or not. If they were legal, maybe they would occasionally consume them, but it wouldn't add up to a lot because the people who really want to consume the drugs are already consuming. Prohibition has a bunch of other effects, whether or not there's a substantial effect in reducing drug consumption. Okay, so let's look at the normative side. I think most of you would agree that virtually all the effects of prohibition I've described so far are undesirable. Okay? Obviously, there can be disagreement about the magnitudes because it's social science. We don't have precise estimates of anything. Few cases, some of you might disagree about the sign, whether it's a positive or negative, but not too much. Okay? But if you think that my analysis, my positive analysis is roughly right, there's no question that most of the effects are things we don't want. Okay? Increased crime and violence, transfers to criminals, so on and so forth. Okay? The potential exception, the thing that most people point to when they advocate prohibition, is the reduction in drug use caused by prohibition. That's what most people would say is the benefit of drug prohibition as opposed to the cost that I've just outlined. Might not be large, but if we were confident that it was really, really small, if you thought that there was almost no effect of prohibition in reducing drug use, and you accepted the rest of my analysis, well, then you'd sort of be done, because you'd say all the effects are negative. The one possible positive effect of reducing drug use is trivial, and so you'd say the analysis is over. But I don't want to argue that. I want to accept that there's some non-trivial reduction in drug use caused by prohibition, and think about how policy should address that. What should policy's view be about drug use and about policies that might try to reduce drug use? Going to come back, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 different perspectives on how policy should treat drug use. I should say first, the question is not just whether drug consumption is good or bad. The question has got to be, that's the economics question, is whether the policy does more harm than good, taking into account all its effects. That's just standard economics. And that means there are really 2 separate questions. One is, should we try to reduce drug use at all through any kind of a policy? Or should we be completely laissez-faire the way we are toward Kellogg's Corn Flakes? If you think government policy should try to reduce drug use, is prohibition the right approach, or is some other kind of policy a better approach, a better ratio of cost to benefits than prohibition? So I think it's useful to think about 4 different perspectives. One is the rational consumer. Strict, standard, good old-fashioned economics model says people do things because they want to, they think they're better off. Their revealed preference says if I see someone doing it, that person must think they're better off doing it than not doing it. You can think of lots of possible reasons, but the standard economic model doesn't even try to really say what the reasons are. We say people's preferences are their preferences, and whatever they're doing must be what they wanted to do. Okay? Doesn't necessarily matter in that model whether drugs are addictive. It doesn't matter that drugs might be harmful for your health or anything else. Okay, the standard, the simplest possible economic model just says people think about all those possible effects, the harms as well as the benefits, just like when you go skiing down a double black diamond. You, in principle, okay, not that I would ever do that. I think that if you're going to prohibit anything, I prohibit that. Okay, but the model is that people think about that. They know there's a risk, but they've willingly taken the risks, and so we let them make that choice. Okay. Now, if you were sure that all drug use were governed by a strictly rational model, then reducing drug use, whether you reduce it via prohibition or you reduce it via sin tax or anything else, is a cost of that policy, not a benefit. Okay? So just like if we banned apples or we taxed apples, okay, the reduction in the consumption of apples is a cost, not a benefit. Okay? So if we're going to try to be somewhat neutral and say drugs are a commodity and people are voluntarily doing it, then we should recognize at least that possibility. And I think anybody who's used drugs, anybody who has friends who's used drugs, who's observed it at all widely, would concede that some drug use probably does fit the rational model. You don't have to agree to all of it, but it's, I think, hard to convince yourself that every single person who smoked some dope in college was making themselves better off as a result. Some of them were sort of having a good time, and it didn't seem to do any obvious thing to themselves or to others. So some of the drug use is probably rational. Okay? So one cost of prohibition is the reduction in drug use that it achieves by those persons who would use drugs responsibly, moderately, rationally, okay, in a legal market. Okay? And that's the same argument that everybody accepts, okay? More or less everybody accepts, I should say, for keeping legal things like alcohol or cigarettes or Ben & Jerry's ice cream and zillions of other things, which are sometimes risky and harmful, but which many people manage to consume without serious harm. That's clearly not the only perspective you should consider about drug use. Okay, so a second one I'll call paternalism. Paternalistic view says some drug users are myopic, they have self-control problems, or they're otherwise irrational. They consume drugs despite their own best interests. Okay, so we should discourage drug use to protect people from themselves. Okay? And it's obvious, even to a hardcore libertarian, that these self-control problems, these myopia problems, these irrational problems, okay, they exist. Okay, some of you don't know this, but I showed up. Well, I didn't quite show up here, but I showed up in Arlington, Virginia, a week ago to give this talk, and the wrong date in my calendar. So people make mistakes, and sometimes some people make systematic, regular, and large mistakes. That's clearly right. Okay, But I want to argue that doesn't necessarily dictate that we should have an intervention, a policy intervention, and certainly not the specific intervention of prohibition. So objection 1 to the paternalistic view, okay, and here my libertarianism will show through relatively strongly. I think that it opens up a Pandora's box of government interventions. Deciding what is myopic behavior and what is rational behavior, or at least innocuous behavior, is easily going to be dictated by majority preferences rather than by any calm, thoughtful balancing of costs and benefits. A good example is marijuana versus alcohol. I think any rational assessment of the risk from alcohol use versus marijuana use says if you're going to prohibit one of them, it should be alcohol, not marijuana. And yet, it's backwards because it turns out more people like consuming alcohol than want to consume marijuana, along with some other historical accidents. Relatedly, paternalistic view can easily be distorted to justify tons of things that I think many, many people would be very uncomfortable with. At times in our past U.S. history, the paternalistic view was used to justify banning books that were allegedly evil. You couldn't get Catcher in the Rye in a public school, a library, because allegedly reading that book was going to be bad for you. Someone was making a decision about what should go in your brain versus not. Think about religion. Some societies have said, we think it's wrong for people not to observe religion. Everybody has to observe the same religion, and we're doing it for your good, so you end up in heaven or whatever. Okay? And other societies have taken just the opposite view. So letting government decide what's in everybody's interest, to me, is a very dangerous thing. Okay? Leave that aside. Don't particularly share that view. Second objection is that the underlying assumptions that drug use is addictive, that it's harmful, that people are myopic, I think is exaggerated, or at least not very different than those same issues with respect to all sorts of legal goods like alcohol, tobacco, and other things. So consistency argues against prohibition, or at least trying to have a similar policy for goods which are similar, because that would breed respect from people about society's rules, instead of having dramatically different rules for things which are not so dramatically different, and that doesn't make sense, and that breeds widespread violations. Okay? It's also possible that if you try to deter drug use, you mainly make people substitute toward alcohol or tobacco, and you really haven't achieved much in terms of reduced harms, of paternalistic harms. Finally, even if you grant all the arguments for paternalism, that implies some intervention, but not necessarily prohibition. The question is still whether the benefits from that intervention exceed its cost, and my view is that prohibition has a modest impact on use, so it's not reducing myopic use very much. Prohibition has very large cost, so it's pretty hard to think that the benefits of prohibition as a way to reduce drug use exceed its cost, even if you think there's an argument for some kind of policy to reduce drug use. Very similar arguments for externalities. I'll go through this a little faster because it's pretty much the same. It's clear that drug use can generate externalities, negative effects on innocent third parties, unborn children, traffic accidents, use of publicly funded health care from people who get sick from consuming drugs, and so on. Absolutely clear that drug use can generate externalities, okay? But again, doesn't necessarily mean we should have an intervention, and certainly not necessarily prohibition. So similar objections. Okay, the magnitude of externalities is often exaggerated. Let me just take one. There's lots of pretty good studies, close to double-blind, placebo-controlled studies about the effect on your driving ability of consuming alcohol versus marijuana. Okay? Marijuana is bad for your driving ability, but alcohol is a lot worse. Okay? So we should think about that when we assess, say, that there are these big negatives, and think about the consistency issue, because marijuana seems to generally make people less good at steering and braking, but also make them drive slower. So they don't get in a ton of accidents because they drive slower, whereas alcohol seems to do the opposite. Okay? Likewise, consistency across other goods. The possibility that attempt to reduce drug use might just generate increased amounts of these other uses. Another point that I think libertarians should emphasize more, and that economists should recognize more, which is calculating net externalities is tricky. Okay? A classic example is, obviously, we should have much higher taxes on, say, tobacco, because people who consume tobacco use a lot of publicly funded health care, and that's a negative externality to everyone else. Not necessarily. It could come out, and approximately seems to come out at current tax rates, that people who consume tobacco die young, so they don't collect Social Security and Medicare. That's a positive externality for everyone who's helping to fund those systems. Now, if you want to use that logic, okay, use that logic, but can do it consistently. Okay? And if you're not going to use the logic, then don't use the logic. what happens is the logic gets applied very selectively, okay, and it's so I think the externality argument needs to be applied much more sort of cautiously and carefully. Finally, the same objection as with paternalism, policy has to balance the costs and benefits of the policy versus what it accomplishes. In my view, prohibition has large costs / externalities itself, okay, and its effect in reducing drug use and therefore externality-related drug use is modest. So it's hard to think that we're getting a net improvement by using prohibition to reduce drug use, even if some other things might be good policies to reduce drug use. So lastly, I should mention morality. Some people think that drugs are so bad that society should make a statement that says drugs are immoral. And the only policy that makes that statement strongly enough is to actually outlaw drugs. There's a certain logical consistency to that view. If you say the only policy that makes a strong enough moral statement is prohibition, then I guess you should endorse prohibition. Okay? But even if you take that view, unless you're putting infinite weight in your calculation of making that moral statement, you should recognize the other effects of prohibition. You could recognize all the things that we talked about, okay, happen that are negatives. And if you use the morality language, I think most people use that language would say that a ton of these effects are immoral. Okay? If there's more violence, some of which affects innocent bystanders, okay, as a result of prohibition, that's a pretty immoral effect. If more children are born infected with HIV because their mother shared dirty needle, that's a fairly immoral effect. That an innocent, newborn, okay, is born sick. If sick people can't get access to medicine because of prohibition, that's an immoral effect. Diminishments of civil liberties, and so on and so forth. More specifically, people who talk about morality like to talk about respect for the law being important and personal responsibilities being important. Prohibiting drugs undercuts both those things. It says drugs are so evil, so powerful, we can't expect to hold people accountable. We have to give them sort of a mulligan because they were under the influence kinds of things. That's sapping society's moral strength if you want to think of it in those terms. The fact that everybody observed prohibition being violated, okay, and thinks, gee, those guys who like to smoke dope get to violate the laws they don't like, maybe I should get to violate the laws I don't like paying my taxes. Okay? That is something that people who like to invoke the morality perspective would also think is immoral. And all that happens as a result of prohibition. So I don't think there's a good moral case for prohibition at all, just the opposite. So to summarize the normative analysis, virtually all of the effects are undesirable. The only possible benefit is reducing drug use. Even that's partly a cost, not a benefit. So even if you think we should try to reduce drug use somehow, okay, prohibition is probably the worst possible approach to doing that. Now, what would the other things be? I'm going to go through this really, really fast. There's a ton of other possibilities. You could subsidize treatment. You could have sin taxes. You could have harm reduction policies like clean needle exchanges, public health information campaigns, age restrictions, and so on and so forth. Okay? Just all I want to say about that for the moment, might come up in the questions, is that any of those approaches is vastly preferable, okay, to prohibition because it doesn't generate a black market. Okay? So whether those things actually have bigger benefits than costs, okay, is an open question. Each of those things should get its own analysis. Okay? And my hunch is that laissez-faire is still the best. That rather than treating drugs like alcohol, tobacco, which is roughly what some of those other things suggested, we should probably treat illegal drugs as legal goods like cappuccinos at Starbucks, okay, rather than treating them as something that we deliberately try to reduce the use of. But reasonable people can, even to libertarians, can by all means say, let's legalize it, but have some policies which try to nudge people in a beneficial direction. Sin taxes, okay, as we have for alcohol and tobacco, would be the most obvious way to do that. Okay, so I should mention briefly, okay, nothing I've said here is specific to drugs. Okay? The same analysis, roughly speaking, would apply if we were talking about alcohol, tobacco, coffee, blue jeans, ice cream, anything for which there's widespread demand and relatively imperfect substitutes. The government prohibited Ben & Jerry's vanilla ice cream. No, you wouldn't get a big black market. Ben & Jerry's would relabel it as, sweet cream ice cream or white ice cream or something, or people would buy Haagen-Dazs vanilla ice cream. But if policy outlawed ice cream, there'd be drive-by shootings for ice cream. There would be quality control issues for ice cream and so on, at least if my analysis is right. Okay? The key factor, in the way I think about it, is the economic incentives that are created by the policy, not the properties of the prohibited good. Okay? So that's why libertarians tend to oppose mandates and prohibitions very, very strenuously. They have reservations about all those other policies, but not to nearly the degree as prohibitions, because prohibitions generate these unintended consequences to a much greater degree. So, to sum up, policies have a range of consequences, both intended and unintended. That's, of course, a huge issue for libertarians, the unintended consequences. At some level, all that libertarians are asking is, when you think about the effects of policies, think about the whole range. Don't just think about the ones you want to happen. Don't just focus on the ones that feel good or sound good. Be sure you're being careful about all the possible ramifications of intervening. In the case of drug prohibition, my analysis says most of the consequences are negative, so it's hard to imagine that the benefits of prohibition exceed the costs. Thank you very much.